Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Jones, and I welcome you to another Life Stories Worldwide live broadcast, where we bring you stories from across the world, all types of stories, people who are finding struggles in their lives, dealing with pain, dealing with rejection, and many more things, and how those lives are being transformed. We are live on Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. Please encourage your friends to join us and watch this story this evening. The live stories from our broadcast can be viewed over again on our YouTube channel, Life Stories at Lunch. And if you join and subscribe, don't forget, you will get then our messages when we're on live if you press the bell on that subscription. And if you can't watch all the time, you can listen when you're walking or jogging, when you're driving in your car or in the gym even. If you log on to Spotify and go to look for Life Stories Worldwide Radio, there you can enjoy the story if you missed it, or you want to watch it, listen to it again. They're on Spotify. So today our guest is Kate Nicholas. Kate is from Milton Keynes in the UK, and Kate has a wonderful story to share. She was facing, she was going through chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and all sorts of treatment and surgery. And it was then that she wrote a book. She'll tell you about the book, what it's called, and why she wrote it. It was a legacy for her children. But I'm going to hand over to Kate now to share her story. Thank you, Kate.
Well, thank you so much, Al. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here this evening with you and to share something about my life and my faith journey. As Alan has said, I'm a preacher. I'm actually a preacher. I'm an author, broadcaster, and consultant, and I live in this small village in a very rural area, about 60 miles above London. I've been married for nearly 30 years now to my wonderful husband, John, and I have two fabulous kids who are not so young now, 24 and 18. And they've got so fed up with me talking about them in my books and in the media that they won't let me do it anymore. So I won't be talking about them anymore this evening. Now, I haven't always been a Christian, and my faith journey has been very far from straightforward. But when I was young, I seemed to have almost the instinctive understanding that there was more to the world than met the eye. I was actually a rather odd and solitary child. I'd spend hours roaming around the fields and woodlands around our house, all on my own. But somehow I never felt alone. I felt as if there was this benign presence watching out for me. I was actually brought up as a Christian by my mother, Margaret, but I was very influenced by my father, Daniel, who was an intense and rather eccentric poet who I think you could describe as an anguished agnostic. Today, he might have been diagnosed as bipolar, but in those days, he was pretty much left to his own devices to try and make sense of himself and of the world. He had a really extraordinary mind. He actually studied in Oxford under J.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings. And his mind ranged far and wide in terms of search for meaning. And he had a good understanding of and could readily quote from the Bible. But he was also fascinated by the spirituality of the East. And he was also obsessed by the work of the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who had very complex religious views. And he shared all this with me, all of which rather confused my understanding of God as a young person. I was actually only 11 years old when my father first told me that he no longer believed that life was worth living. And it's a very hard thing to hear at that age. And I spent most of my teenage years absolutely terrified that he was going to take his own life. And as I grew up, I found it increasingly impossible to reconcile my father's pain, everything he was going through, with this idea of an omnipotent, loving God that I was being taught about in my mother's church. To me, God seemed very distant and seemed to be lacking in empathy. I thought he was a bit like an absent landlord. And I really struggled with this question of why such an all-powerful, all-loving God would allow my father and others to suffer so much. And when I failed to find an answer in the church, I actually turned my back in anger and I walked away. I then became a fairly nightmare adolescent, and I would attack anyone who professed belief, including my mother, who I regarded as gullible, naive, and deluded, completely ignoring the fact that she was a highly respected journalist with a fine critical mind. And I would go out looking for stories of human suffering and hold them up to her like a mirror, hoping to reveal to her the irrationality of her belief. Well, at the age of 18, probably to my parents' slight relief, I left home to go and study a degree in fine art at the University College of Wales in Aberystwyth, which is a seaside town in West Wales, which had a distinctly New Age vibe to it. The town and the surrounding countryside were absolutely full of colourful characters who seemed to be stuck in the 1970s, and they included Wiccans and wannabe druids, as well as some people who were attracted to the beliefs of the early Celtic Christians. Now, these were a group who in the 7th century developed a particularly British branch of Christianity as an alternative to what was emerging as the Catholic Church, the Universal Church. And these early Christians worshipped in and lived in Ireland, Wales, and Northern England in particular. And they had a profound relationship with nature. And as an art student who was very interested in landscape painting, I was rather intrigued by their belief that God could be experienced through appreciation of his creation. And I quite liked the idea that we could connect to this thing that they call God without ever stepping inside the doors of a church. It seemed to resonate with those really early...
He's coming. Jesus is coming. I can't wait to hear the trumpet call. He's coming. Jesus is coming. And when he comes, we'll crown him Lord of all. And when he comes, we'll crown him Lord of all. Life Stories. Life Stories Worldwide is brought to you every Monday night at 8 p.m. UK time. We broadcast live on Facebook, Zoom and YouTube. So why not join us every Monday night at 8 p.m. UK time.
Childhood experiences I'd had. So I spent a lot of time when I was in Aberystwyth out sketching by the sea on the seashore and wandering around the sheep-covered hillsides, wondering if I might again feel that presence, that benign presence, which I've now begun to think of as the numinous. Well, after completing a master's degree, I then moved down to London and I went to work for an advertising agency. And I think it's fair to say that after those early inklings of exploration, that my 20s were a bit of a spiritual wasteland. I must say, I did have a lot of fun. I went out on the town nearly every night with my colleagues. I went to the theatre, I went to films and to gigs. And for a while, I even went out with the lead singer of an indie rock band and ended up meeting lots of famous bands, all of which was really quite exciting. I think I was really caught up in the materialism of the 1980s. But after a few years, I began to become rather disillusioned with this rampant consumerism that I was being paid as a job to encourage. I didn't have the courage to get out, and I didn't really know what an alternative way of living might be. Until one day I had an epiphany. It was about 2 hours into a really interminable meeting about what colour kettle jug we were going to put into an advertisement. And I was sitting there zoning out when suddenly a thought hit me like a bullet. I don't know what God wants me to do in my life, but this isn't it. It was one of those kind of thoughts that sometimes seem to come from somewhere other than your own brain. and it was absolutely impossible to ignore. It hit me like a bullet, as I say. So, to the bewilderment of my employer, and I think the consternation of some of my family and friends, I came out, handed in my notice, sold just about everything I owned, and bought a round the world ticket. As you do. I wasn't sure what I was looking for when I set off, and I thought I might travel for around about 6 months. But in the end, my journey turned into a 2.5 years spiritual quest. I started my journey in Nepal, and I made my way slowly down through India, through Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and quite a number of the Indonesian islands. And I was absolutely fascinated as I traveled by what seemed to be this all-pervading spirituality in the countries that I was going through. And the people that I met just seemed to have such amazing belief, which was such a contrast to the UK, where I think religious belief had been increasingly seen as a bit of a fringe preoccupation. Now, I even went so far in this interest to study Mahayana Buddhism at the Dalai Lama's school up in Dharamshala, India, which is in the foothills in the Himalayas, and also Theravada Buddhism in what's called a forest wat in Thailand, a forest temple in Thailand. But although I was very interested in it, I soon realized that the answer didn't lie in that direction for me. And I think, if anything, it only reinforced my increasing conviction that a universe without God didn't really make any much sense to me. I then went on to Sydney, where I began to work for UNICEF. Now, my travels throughout Asia had taken me pretty much off the tourist track and had actually exposed me to terrible poverty for the first time in my life. And I really couldn't shake the conviction that this was not how the world was meant to be. So I decided that I needed to, in changing career, to dedicate myself to social action, to social justice. And I ended up with UNICEF working on a campaign to try and raise funds and support for victims in war-torn Somalia, which at the time was being torn apart by various warlords. And in Sydney, I also met my wonderful husband, John. Now, initially, I thought I was going to end up living on Bondi Beach, having met an Australian. But it turned out that I'd met an Australian who wanted to live in the UK, which wasn't quite what I had planned. But before we left the country, we decided to travel right the way around Australia, and we went up through the Great Red Centre, sleeping in the outback. And my husband was a photographer at that stage, and he was taking these extraordinary photographs, and it was an amazing experience. We'd camp out, and I'd wake up at dawn, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest habitation. I remember standing up and looking around me and thinking, I am the kind of, there's nothing, no other living thing as far as I can see. I'm the tallest thing in the landscape. And I used to wake in the morning and watch the burning sun rise over this great empty expanse of the Australian desert. And in that eerie silence, once again, I thought I felt the presence of the divine, the numinous. However, once again, back in the UK, my spirituality took a back seat, as this time I entered the secular world of the newsroom. Now, I started out as a freelance journalist for papers like The Independent and The Observer. But like my mother, I really reveled in the whole world of journalism, and I rapidly climbed the ladder, and I became editor and then editor-in-chief of a current affairs magazine owned by the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, who was also a major publisher. And I would regularly cover the spin that was coming out of Downing Street and Whitehall. This was just after the Blairite government had come in. And I did a lot of commentary, for example, on the weapons of mass destruction issue in Iraq. And I became a regular TV commentator on various current affairs and news programs. And it soon began to dawn on me that I'd become a professional cynic. I found that the more voracious my criticism was, the more outspoken I was, the more the magazines flew off the shelves, much to my employer's delight. But at the same time as all this was going on,
He's coming. Jesus is. Life Stories. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Life Stories at Lunch, where you can see and hear many more life stories. Don't forget to click the bell so we can notify you when we are live on YouTube.
I also started to have these really weird chance meetings with Christians. Now, at first, I tried to dismiss them, but I was forced to admit that far from being naive and deluded, these are actually really quite intelligent people who spoke in very rational and compelling terms about their faith. And they really piqued my curiosity. So, to my own surprise, I bought myself a copy of the Bible. And over the next couple of years, I read it cover to cover twice while commuting on the train down to London. And eventually, after doing all this reading, I was forced to conclude, like the popular Christian writer C.S. Lewis, that either Jesus had to have been mad, bad, or truly the Son of God. Now, the Jesus that I encountered in the Bible seemed to me eminently sane and profoundly good. So the only option left to me was to accept this extraordinary, unavoidable and world-shaking truth that this man was and is God. So, a couple of decades after turning my back on my childhood church, I started to go to my local parish church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Oney, Buckinghamshire. That's actually the church where the world-famous hymn Amazing Grace was written and where I now preach. At the time, I kept trying to keep a pretty low profile, but one day a friend of mine encouraged me to go up and be blessed at the altar rail. So I went up and I knelt at the altar rail and I bowed my head. And as I did so, and as the vicar put his hand on my head, it felt as if I was being filled with light. It was the most extraordinary feeling. And I remember rising up again and walking back to my seat. And as I did so, I had tears of joy literally running down my face. Amazing. Perhaps the most amazing thing is that from that point onwards, everything began to change. I was encouraged by my vicar and started to train to be a preacher in the church. And I actually then went on and gave up my rather lucrative and respected job in the media to go and join Christian aid agency World Vision, who worked with vulnerable children all around the world. And I joined them initially in the UK and later as Global Chief Communications Officer. And having joined this organization, I found I was surrounded by these really inspiring Christians, most of whom seemed to be very rational, and they were all very passionate about putting their faith into action. And as I traveled to different parts of the world, I experienced a real diversity of the way in which people worshipped and what God's church looked like. I joined services under a tree in Malawi, on the top of a shopping mall in Manila, of all places. And I attended the world's largest church in South Korea, which has 20,000 in the congregation, as well as praying in a tiny shipping container in a migrants camp in South America. And as I did so, I met extraordinary faith-filled individuals, some of whom lived in some of the toughest parts of the world. These were people who had virtually nothing, but in the face of grinding poverty and often the most terrible natural disasters and some conflicts, maintained a deep sense of trust that God somehow had a plan and purpose for their lives. And everywhere I went, from the flooded slums of Jakarta to the remote rural villages of East Africa, from the container camps of North Mexico to the HIV clinics of the Dominican Republic. I began to see Jesus at work, wandering through these fetid, horrible alleyways, bending beside the broken backs of workers in these barren fields, and providing comfort for those for whom hope was all but lost. And then, in my early 50s, I was diagnosed with cancer. Now, at first, I was told that the cancer was stage 3 and had spread to my limb system and under my collarbone. And as such, I was told that the cancer was inoperable, but treatable. But a month later, I was told that in actual fact, the cancer was stage 4 and had spread to the pericardial sac around my heart and to the mediastinal area, the pleural sac of my lungs. My prognosis was not good. And the surgeon told me that even if the tumour shrunk down enough with the chemotherapy, that he'd have to make a decision on whether or not it was worth doing surgery based on how much time I had left. It's pretty tough to hear. Now, yeah, as you can imagine, as a wife and mother, this made it particularly difficult to hear. I will never forget the day that I had to tell my children that their mother had cancer. It was one of the hardest days of my life. I think it's never good to hear the words, "you have cancer," from a doctor. But I believe it's actually far harder for the family of someone diagnosed than for the cancer patient themselves. As a patient, you're often caught up in a whirlwind of diagnosis and treatment, but family members are often left standing by, just feeling helpless, not knowing what to do. And as I came to terms slowly with my prognosis, I started to think about what I could leave, as Alan said, as a legacy. And I started to put together letters and packages for my children. I had cards for their significant birthdays, wedding day gifts, and I actually had quilts made out of their baby clothes to give to their first children, who I thought I would never see. And I also started to put together photograph albums. But I soon realised that photos, they provide a wonderful record for how you changed outwardly over the years. They say nothing about how you changed inwardly, about how you saw the world, and critically what you believed.
He's coming. Jesus is coming. I can't wait to hear the trumpet call. He's coming. Jesus is coming. And when he comes, we'll crown him Lord of all. And when he comes, we'll